you've got to control your borders, you've got to grip migration, but you've got to call out Farage.
This view that free speech is under attack in Britain, on university campuses and in the liberal media, and people are being arrested for their posts, is amazingly widespread.
Keir Starmer can't afford to be squeezed on both sides, and he should be as worried about that left flank as the reform right flank.
So, at the beginning of the summer, Nigel Farage said he was going to dominate the agenda through August. He announced his plan to essentially have weekly press conferences. And since delivery is the theme of Keir Starmer's relaunched government this week, well, we have to say Nigel Farage did deliver on what he said he was going to do, because he dominated the political headlines, with the exception of the interlude around the Ukraine war and Keir Starmer having to go to Washington and trying to get Donald Trump to listen to European views on Ukraine. But if we set that aside, and we'll no doubt come back to that in a future podcast, Farage did do what oppositions are supposed to do, which is occupy the moment when the government ministers go abroad on their holidays. And I would pick up just a couple of issues which we can unpack. He started off, didn't he, saying, I'm going to deport illegal migrants who are here. And he was the first politician, sort of mainstream, I mean, he is now mainstream, he's in the House of Commons, first politician to put that on the agenda in a big way in Britain. So that's the first thing. Then, of course, there was this whole issue around the hotel in Essex and the court cases, which he leapt on, and the government's legal argument about why they needed these hotels to have to house asylum seekers. And there are a couple of other issues as well, aren't there? There's been this issue of the flags, whether you are allowed or should be encouraged to put up Union Jacks and crosses of St George around the country, which he's certainly dived in on. And then finally, he is at the moment right now, he's got his party conference this weekend, but he is in Washington and he's been giving evidence to the House Judiciary Committee around this issue of what he would call free speech or two-tier justice, or, these cases, of which the one this week is the Father Ted co-creator, who tweeted things about transgender people and was arrested when he got off the plane by 5 police officers at Heathrow. And Farage is sort of jumping on these quotes free speech issues. What's your feeling about how did he come to dominate the summer in the way that he has?
Well, if you take the previous conversation we were having about Angela Rayner, Prime Minister's questions yesterday, in which Kemi Badenoch kind of rather oddly chose not to go on Angela Rayner, calling for her to be sacked and making that a big deal at PMQs.
But she was following our advice to stick to the economy. Well, we can't blame her for that, Ed.
No, but this is my point. Her operation said, but she wasn't just talking about kind of Westminster insider issues. I mean, I have to say, I think the Angela Rayner tax issue is like a massive cross-nation issue. So I don't quite understand that. If Kemi Badenoch and her team had every day for the whole of August gone on the economy, had a weekly press conference, demanded action from the government on growth, calling them out on their tax decisions, if they had made that their August campaign, then by the time you got to this week's PMQs and she had done that, people would have said, well, of course Kemi Badenoch is doing that, because that's what they've been doing for the last 6 weeks. But the truth is, the Conservatives were really fairly absent on that economic issue. Bell Stride popped up every now and then, but frankly, what they spent the whole time doing is chasing Farage.
Well, she did give that rather strange interview where she said, being opposition is a bloody hard job and you're bloody lucky I'm doing it. And I don't have to, by the way.
But she was also doing interviews where she's sort of, trying to claim that the Lucy Connolly, who pleaded guilty and went to prison, that this was an example of two-tier justice. You guys,
this is the woman who tweeted about burning down asylum hotels during the riots, wasn't it? And she was sentenced to prison. Yeah.
But following the Farage agenda, basically the Conservatives saying, kind of wanting to agree with what Farage was saying around his mass deportation scheme. What Farage set out to do at the beginning of the summer was to link crime, immigration, and asylum and hotels and the cost of that, and to do that in a weekly press conference where he drove the news, and he did that very effectively. I think in the early...
You've explained why you haven't explained, but you've shown why the Conservatives didn't respond to that. Why did the Labour government allow that to happen?
Well, I think in the first period of August, when, if you remember, Labour was signing their landmark treaty with France for one in, one out. There were riots, which I don't think was something that Nigel Farage had sort of organised or encouraged. He wasn't really controlling that. There was a risk to him about sort of the elision of his press conferences with this sort of kind of more Tommy Robinson style kind of aggression and protest. I think in that period, it wasn't clear that Farage was breaking through, but I do think the court case changes everything, because at that point, suddenly, the government is on the back foot legally. It looks like what they've done, according to the courts, is wrong. They're going to have to move people out of the Epping Hotel. It then gets subsequently overturned by the Court of Appeal with actually a kind of rather coruscating judgment on the original judge decision. But in the second half of August, I don't think that the government had an alternative message or strategy, and at that point they were on the back foot on the migration issue. And it probably goes back to a question of your point about delivery. Think about where the government is on this Farage agenda. They could try not to talk about it. It's actually really hard to say, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about the National Health Service or childcare, when the newspapers, but also kind of a lot of public concern is on these issues around migration, hotels and small boats coming over. As it happened, the August small boats numbers were quite low, but they'd been higher earlier in the year. I think when you look at the government's kind of strategy with reform on these issues, there is kind of definitely a worry around past Labour voters about Farage's cultural attacks, the veering into xenophobia. I think actually some of the free speech stuff as well, claiming that the online safety bill is flawed. But people also want to know that we're not wasting loads of money on asylum hotels and that we're managing the borders. And until the government is showing that it is gripping that and really delivering improvements, they're on the back foot. And I think they are still on the back foot, because even though deportations are up and even though overall immigration is coming down, there's still a lot of people in asylum hotels, even though they've accelerated processing, because there is such a backlog in appeals. And the French deal might turn out to be really important, but so far, although there's people in detention, nobody's actually yet been sent back to France. That's not going to happen until this month. Very hard to go on the pushback against reform and Farage on those issues until you're showing you're delivering, and the delivery has not yet happened, has it?
But if you were a progressive liberal, small L liberal supporter of Labour, wouldn't you be sort of frustrated that you're kind of chasing Farage's tail? And you're never going to outbid him. You don't want to outbid him, but yes, the Tories are trying to outbid him. And Robert Jenrick is this week saying, I actually want, net migration from the country. We want, Britain shrinking as a country. So the government's response is quite kind of managerial. We're doing this change. We've got this agreement with France. We're making these, changes to asylum rules. But they're not making a kind of defence of why immigration's a good thing, why a plural society is beneficial to us all, why we should celebrate Britain's cultural diversity, why Britain's got a proud reputation for being a home for people fleeing persecution. I think there'll be a lot of sort of progressives feeling like, who's making that argument at the moment? All we're hearing is Farage, 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 and kind of Farage light from political opponents who see his poll lead and are kind of transfixed by it.
That is right. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, it looks like Labour's gone down in the polls and Reform has gone up. Your automatic thinking is that must be people who previously voted Labour who are now switching to vote Reform. But actually what we know when you analyse those numbers, there's very little of that going on. The big surge in Reform voting is really happening from a collapse in Conservative support. And Labour is more challenged by losing votes to the Greens or to the Liberal Democrats or to the nascent Corbyn party on the left. So you're completely right.
And by the way, the Green Party now has a new, much more populist left-wing leader, Zach Belansky,
who doesn't really want to talk about green issues as much as the wider range of Corbyn-style left issues. He wants to leave NATO, have a kind of more open migration, have a wealth tax. I mean, all of those things which are a worry to Keir Starmer on his left flank. I think the having said that, centrist voters and Labour voters are really worried that we need to control migration. And it is hard to go on the attack on the Farage's plan wholeheartedly until you've started to get delivery on your side, and they've got more work to do there, clearly. Doesn't mean, though, you can't pick off kind of individual issues. I mean, one of the things which was very striking in the Farage speech is when he talks about not just deporting, but they're setting aside £2 billion, not simply to incentivise. They will pay people to go home, but they're also going to pay countries to take them. And he said, yeah, well, I mean, if they've come from Afghanistan or from Iran or from Eritrea, then that's where they should go back to. Now, this is a bit of a dilemma. When pressed, he then says, well, maybe not women and children first. I asked Wes Streeting about this on John GMB earlier in the week. If you are a gay man who has come seeking asylum here in Britain from Afghanistan or from Iran, I mean, being sent back there by Nigel Farage as a fighting age man, I mean, it's sending you, if not to your death, at least to kind of imprisonment and persecution in countries where being gay is against the law. You would think that would be something you would be calling out and going for pretty aggressively. But at the moment, Labour doesn't seem to want to do that. I gave Wes Streeting the opportunity to really go for that, and he was careful in his language. And at the moment, it feels to me as though Labour thinks, this is the broader Labour, they're either thinking that until we've got delivery, it's hard for us to go full frontal on those cultural issues or the racism issues or the sums not adding up.
You've got to demonstrate competence and control of the border before you can make the pro-immigration case.
Right? Or they're saying, well, we're more vulnerable to losing votes from Labour to Reform than people think, and therefore we have to appease the Reform style arguments. We have to kind of go softly on that. Now, my personal view is that is, for the reasons you said, a mistake. You've got to control your borders. You've got to grip migration, but you've got to call out Farage not only then on economic gaps, but also on the things which culturally people find offensive. Because if not, you're going to drain votes to the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, and that is, Keir Starmer can't afford to be squeezed on both sides, and he should be as worried about that left flank as the Reform right flank.
I mean, what Farage has done, not just this summer, but in the last couple of years, is he has made himself, much less toxic, much less fringe, and more, to use a word I used earlier, mainstream.
Although the polling says, who would you want to be Prime Minister? He polls very badly on that question compared to Keir Starmer or even Kemi Badenoch.
So that's a big challenge for him to continue to sort of build his credibility. But it's quite hard to argue that a person who is giving evidence to the US Congress today, is a loony, is irrelevant, or is a kind of dangerous populist who we can't take seriously. Sorry, is a dangerous populist, and we should ignore him. I think he's definitely put Reform centre stage. And I think given that they are there, you do now have to engage full on, don't you, in the kind of political attack that Labour would deliver against the Tories, for example, the Tories would deliver against Labour. And of course, it's hard to work out, although I think it's kind of in many ways much easier for the Labour Party to work out how it would take on Reform, much harder for the Conservatives because, they're fishing more in the same pond, although not exclusively.
And they spent all of August fishing in that pond for what result? I mean,
yes,
I just don't see how saying we agree with Nigel Farage helps Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick at all. It may help Robert Jenrick become leader of the Conservative Party, but I don't see how it helps the Conservatives. I mean, so many centrist Conservatives must be appalled by what they're seeing.
Yes, I think they are, and they're that there's still that kind of Cameron coalition, which is sort of splintered out there in the country and not really found a home. Although, I would say if you're the Labour MP for Kensington or the Labour MP for Chelsea, you're probably feeling a bit more secure than the Labour MP for Hartlepool and the Labour MP for Sedgefield right now, which is a kind of, an interesting commentary on where our kind of politics has got to. And I think it's also interesting that at the party conference I was reading they've got coming this weekend, you still don't have the kind of business community turning up. So there's not yet the kind of establishment saying these people may well be the next government.
There is a lounge being sponsored by Heathrow.
Yes, I saw that. And I think the sort of shooting conservation organisation is also turning up there. But I've got one thing where I feel like the government could do something and they're just not. This issue of free speech. Wes Streeting, you mentioned him earlier, and by the way, thank you, Wes, for being a gold subscriber and also taking part in our summer episodes. He says the police should concentrate on the serious job of fighting crime. When he's asked about the arrest of Graham Linehan, that's the comedian who co-wrote Father Ted I was referring to earlier, he says, it is. He essentially says, it's ridiculous. The police should get on with policing. And Keir Starmer, or Number 10, said, the Prime Minister thinks the police should get on with policing. But the Metropolitan Police Commissioner says, well, in which case, please will you change the law because we are following your laws. By the way, not Labour laws, but laws passed by previous governments. So I think these free speech issues are they are creating real anger out there, and also a feeling particularly when people don't always see the police on their streets and they feel like if my car was stolen, no police officer would turn up, and 5 police officers come to arrest this guy. Although to be fair, it was at the airport where the police tend to be heavily armed and turn up in numbers. So why? It seems to me you could do something there. You could, you'd at least, it's a sort of defensive manoeuvre perhaps. But I think the Labour government should address this issue because I think more and more of these cases, if they happen, are going to fuel this feeling that the country and particularly the government's got a totally wrong set of priorities. And there was a very good article in the New Statesman this week by someone called George Manahan, who just reminded us of, John Stuart Mill's arguments and George Orwell's arguments and Voltaire's arguments about free speech and why, the Labour government must not let this particular aspect of the Farage case, which he's, advocating today in Washington, go unchallenged or unaddressed.
Look, I totally agree with you. And I bet you the senior leaders in the Metropolitan Police Force were saying down the line, what on earth happened here? How on earth did we end up taking this action at Heathrow in this way? I'd be very surprised if this was a big strategic decision by the police. But you are right that there is a running sore here, and it would be a good thing for the government with the police to grip it. And if that means reviewing the law in the same way as they also need to review aspects of the operation of the ECHR. Article 8, the right to family life, is clearly causing problems. You don't have to leave the ECHR and give in to Farage to get on that reform agenda. They're right to say, of course, you should fly the St George's flag and the Union Jack. You can't allow the flag to be taken over by the far right. There are things you can do which you need to do which aren't defensive to close off those kind of attacks from Farage, while at the same time making the case that his economic sums palpably don't add up on his border plans or on the economy more widely or on the NHS, and making the case that the language he uses is divisive and dangerous. And we had Steve Baker, the former Brexiteer, calling out the Conservatives for not going after Farage on that dehumanising language that they have been following Farage down that line. The truth is, George, though, really hard to go after Farage on the economy if you haven't sorted out your economic argument, and that's what Rachel Reeves needs to do. We'll talk about that in future weeks. Really hard to go after Farage full throat on the divisive and nasty language around migration when you haven't yet made the progress you wanted to make on sorting out the borders. And they've done a lot of things, and and I'm going to champion their successes, while at the same time saying clearly it is not yet delivered in the way in which Keir Starmer and Yvette would have wanted in the first year. And they need to do that. The good thing is they've not got a general election this autumn. On the other hand, what was the briefing this week? The solution from Number 10 is we're back to compulsory ID cards. Nigel Farage is against...
You were always a fan of those, weren't you?
I've never been against them in principle. I don't have a free speech or a libertarian view. My view has always been is massively expensive. It may be less expensive than it used to be. Making pensioners who haven't got passports sign up to get an ID card in order to go to the GP has never seemed that sensible. It wasn't surprised to me that Wes Streeting this week was rather cautious about the idea of compulsory ID cards. But when it comes to small boats in the Channel, nobody on a small boat is arriving or going to be arriving with a British ID card. But in order to
Surely that's the point.
Well, I know, but in order to legitimately work in Britain now as a non-British citizen or to live, you now have to have, since the summer, an e-visa. You have to have a digital ID as a non-British passport holder to function legally in Britain. Doesn't stop you coming on a small boat, and it doesn't stop you doing illegal work with an illegal employer. The idea that ID cards, compulsory ID cards, solves any of those problems at all.
So I think one of the ironies here is that I was a Conservative backbencher who voted against ID cards, but thought it was a mistake when I was doing so, and I was just sort of towing the party line. And you were a Labour government MP voting for the kind of, I don't know if you voted for it, but anyway, supporting Tony Blair's ID plan whilst actually thinking it was not very good.
Can I point out that the Chancellor of the Exchequer who then ditched them was you? And I thought it was a very wise decision.
Well,
and the idea, if you want to take Nigel Farage on his crazy plans, which don't make any difference, and where the sums don't add up, I'm not sure compulsory ID cards is the best thing to lead with.
What about talking about digital solutions? Elon Musk. We should just mention our old friend in passing, because for those who haven't followed this, although he has obviously a very, very big following on X, which he owns, he has this week been laying into Nigel Farage. And he posted this yesterday. He said, Farage is weak, runny sauce. Not sure what that means. Weak, runny sauce, so I guess like a thin gravy. He won't let reform even stand up for their own people. And e.g. punishing their Epping member, and he will change nothing of significance politically. Go with Advance UK, Ben and Tommy for the real change that's needed to save Britain. Then he has various Union Jacks he posts on his thing. And of course, this is Tommy Robinson, the far-right leader, and Ben Habib, who used to be a UKIP MEP, didn't he? And he was sort of essentially fell out with Farage. I mean, there are splits we talked about splits on the left, and obviously we've talked about the Conservative reform battle. But there is, this further split on the further right on the spectrum.
It will do Nigel Farage no harm being attacked by Elon Musk for not being extreme enough and not joining Tommy Robinson, who has a very, very nasty checkered history himself in terms of his entanglements with the law, but also the BNP style rhetoric he uses in a white nationalist way around immigration. The thing I should ask you, though, because it's not only Elon Musk. I mean, I mentioned this on the podcast while you were away.
I know where you're going.
There were you in the Cotswolds convening dinner with JD Vance and rising star Conservatives. JD Vance is the Trump's vice president, has himself got onto some of this rather AFD Elon Musk style leaning. Did you put him straight that backing Tommy Robinson is not the right place for JD Vance to be?
I did make the case for the centre ground of British politics. I think
by the way, which JD Vance is these days quite a long way away from.
I will tell you one thing though, which I'm quite struck when I meet Americans, not just the vice president. You know, this view that free speech is under attack in Britain on university campuses and in the liberal media, and people are being arrested for their posts, is amazingly widespread. When I go and teach at Stanford and go to Silicon Valley, you know, you meet people who are not active politicians who absolutely believe this to be the case.
And we are now North Korea, according to the Daily Mail and Nigel Farage. North Korea?
Yeah. Well, I haven't yet seen Keir Starmer appear at a big military parade in Beijing.
I know.
I think Keir Starmer would wish at moments that the Labour Party, and particularly the Labour Parliamentary Party, voted the way they vote in the North Korean Parliament. No, anyway, I'm just saying it is. You know, I think if you think this particularly this free speech issue is, you know, somehow a total distraction or totally overblown, the view has gone quite wide. That Britain's quite intolerant.
I'm going to spend the coming weeks drawing out from you the kind of inside reflections on the J.D. Vance dinner and how that all went. But in the meantime, we have one more thing we need to talk about.
He had some good Elon Musk stories, I'll tell you. But
do you want to do one now?
I can't do one on air.
The great thing about George Osborne I've learned over the last 2 years is he always says, I can't say it on air. But if you wait long enough, he'll crack. So listeners... Yeah. Have patience. We'll get there in the end. In the meantime, we're going to take a break and then we're going to come back and talk about the Downing Street reorganisation.